Hi, it's Jill Schlesinger, host of the Better Off podcast. On today's show, we're talking gender inequality, the Me Too movement, and what has to happen next.
It's not just about fixing the HR department, establishing people throughout the organization to hear complaints who aren't in HR so that people can go to people they feel comfortable with, having actual repercussions where people actually lose their jobs and don't just have to apologize and spend 2 weeks in rehab.
Rather than trying to say, let's keep the young men and young women separate when they come into organizations, let's bring them all together and create a uniform mentoring and support group that cuts across all gender norms.
Welcome to the Better Off podcast. We're sponsored by Betterment, the largest independent online financial advisor. We just had the first anniversary of the Women's March. It was celebrated with marches across the globe, trying to figure out what we're going to do with this Me Too movement. Well, today on the program, we've got two guests who are going to help dive down into this topic. Leigh Gallagher is the editor-at-large at Fortune magazine. Jack Myers, he's the founder of Media Village and the author of The Future of Men, Men on Trial. In this discussion, we're going to talk about what needs to occur in the workplace to move the needle on this issue.
You're listening to Better Off with Jill Schlesinger.
All right, it is time for one of my favorite people to be introduced to the podcast, Leigh Gallagher, who is the senior editor-at-large at Fortune and also author. Her book is The Airbnb Story. Leigh, welcome to the show.
Jill, thank you. You are also one of my favorite people.
Oh, I love that. Also, exciting, so amazing, Jack Myers, the author of The Future of Men, the founder, I just wrote it down, now I can't find it, the founder of Media Village, which is some sort of conglomeration, blah-blah-blah, gobbledygook thing about online. It's an online destination for media, advertising, and one other thing, marketing?
Media marketing, advertising, thought leadership.
But more importantly, author of a book called The Future of Men. Jack, we start Better Off with a very important question. You ready?
Yes.
Best financial decision you've ever made or career decision?
Best financial decision I've ever made was to buy Facebook when it was 18.
That was a good one.
Worst
financial. Don't even do it. We'll do the worst one at the end of the program.
Okay. Got it. I know what it is.
All right. Best financial decision, buying Facebook at 18. Leigh Gallagher. You cover business, finance. What's your best financial decision? Did you buy something? Did you get in on Airbnb early on because you were covering it?
I didn't. That would be a conflict, unfortunately. Believe me, I have an aunt who's a stockbroker, and she called me and she suggested that. I said, sorry, I can't. But, business journalists are famously bad about their own finances. So one thing that I did that was really important in my own personal finance life was I moved to New York in my 20s, took a job as a journalist, which paid almost nothing, no kidding. Mm-hmm. And I racked up a lot of credit card debt in my 20s because everybody was getting married. And I thought, I'm not going to sacrifice anything. I'm going to live my life.
Right.
When the real estate broker shows you the small apartment, they say Manhattan's your living room. So anyway, so I paid that off. I took an apartment that really allowed me I got a great deal on an apartment. This was later in my 20s, and paid it off and worked really hard to pay it off. That was really, obviously, there was no other choice. It had to happen, but that was one
That's
thing.
Good. Excellent. Well, I have invited you guys here to talk a little bit about this crazy moment that we have of women in society, but more specifically in the workplace, who are finding their voices. I'm wondering, Leigh, whether you think that this is something that was knowable, that of course this would happen, or had you been hearing about these kinds of things? You do cover technology quite a bit, so the whole bro culture. What was your reaction as all of this has snowballed?
Well, I think we knew many things. We knew that there's a persistent gender gap. We knew that many workplaces, the culture is stacked against women. We know that women have been dropping out of the workforce around child rearing. A lot of that involves workplace policies. What I think people didn't know was the extent to which this actual harassment was happening. And, I think we've seen there's a real bell curve. But I mean, I will say, with the exception of people in those industries, people in Hollywood, everyone knew about Harvey Weinstein, they say. So I think there was a don't ask, don't tell kind of quiet acknowledgement that this went on. But I think everyone has been shocked at the pace, at the severity, at just the sort of snowball effect, and saying that it's a good thing that this is all coming out in the open.
Well, maybe no, this person isn't so shocked because Jack Myers, in his foreword to his book, The Future of Men, wrote, and this is in September of 2015, as I wrote this book, I recognized how our society, culture, companies, and lives are permeated by inappropriate sexual activity, sexism, misogyny, and pornography, and how accepted this has become. So you have not been shocked by any of this, I imagine.
Not only have I not been surprised, but you referred to this as a crazy moment in time. I think it's the first sane moment in time we've had in a long time. I think when you look at the decades of harassment, misbehavior, objectification, that's where the craziness was happening in a lot of ways. When the Harvey Weinstein story broke, I wrote a piece that said this is the tip of the iceberg and we're about to go through a tsunami. I did see it coming, and I saw it coming not because I'm particularly prescient, but because I've done a lot of research on this younger generation that's just coming into the workforce. They've grown up with the internet, they've grown up with mobile, they've grown up with completely different attitudes toward gender relationship and gender norms, and they're simply not willing to accept the misbehavior. There are a lot of patterns we're going to see emerging with women becoming much more forceful, and there are also a lot of patterns of complicity in organizations, Leigh, that you refer to, not just among men, but complicity among HR groups, human resource groups, talent groups, and female executives as well, that I think we're going to see surface.
Leigh, how accountable do we hold the enablers of this? What if there was an open and notorious attitude by not just HR, but executives, whether it's an executive producer or the person who overseeing news or just anyone else? Should those people lose their jobs?
Well, I think that if it's obvious that an executive knew and enabled, I think that yes. And you just never know. It ends up being, he said, or he said, she said. And it's very hard to get to the bottom of that. And, you can say, how could no one know this was happening? We just don't know. So I think it's very muddy. I think it's the most important thing is to get the bad seed out the door.
It is hard, Jack, because I remember when I owned my own business and I found out about an inappropriate situation, and it wasn't an abuse, it was actually a consensual affair. I was very concerned as an owner that somebody high up was having an affair with somebody who he had power over, and you got to cut it out. You just got to cut it out. You can't do that. One of you got to leave. That's that, because otherwise this is not right. Is that attitude what we're going to have to see in organizations? All these people are getting nervous, people can't flirt anymore and workplace flirtation's okay. Is it okay?
Well, those are big issues, and they're not resolved. The answers, we don't really have the answers. What is okay, what isn't okay, and how do you get approval? Is it okay for me to say that you look very nice today?
Thank you. That was fine with me.
Good.
You can hug me also, by the way.
But when I say it now, I'm also concerned, is that appropriate or not? I think that a lot of men are asking similar questions, but more importantly, when it comes to the questions of who should be, who shouldn't be fired, the idea that people didn't know things, whether it be those who have been openly outed for their misbehavior are one thing, but to say that no one knew what was going on, both men and women knew. The men who are married where other women and men knew what their behavior was but didn't tell their wives. There's been a code of secrecy that's been allowed to permeate corporations, businesses, organizations, and neighborhoods, families, groups. And I think that code of silence is now broken. There's no more omerta in gender relationships.
I think it also gets really complicated because power comes into play. And when it's the star, the boss, whoever, the person who holds control over your career or who holds control over your department. And I think there's so much stacked against coming forward. You could lose your whole career, and no one wants to do that. And then the other thing is that sometimes it's not always so cut and dry. I mean, even in the Matt Lauer case, there are many things that were cut and dry, but the woman who came forward and said it was consensual, and said it really isn't, even though I said, what was I going to say?
Yeah, that's a funny thing because I think that the difference is when you're 22 years old and you're starting your career, your male boss says, here we are in the Olympic Village, like, come on over and hang out with me, which sounds really fun. And then you're in that moment where maybe you may or may not want to be. Let's just say you do want to be there. But then things progress. And then you feel like, oh, my God, if I say no, what happens to my job? Is this a career killer?
I am sure there are many, many women who have had what the man would call consensual sex, where the woman has had her teeth clenched and wondered how long is it going to take to get through this, or how many times do I have to do this, but where she felt she had no choice if she wanted her career to go forward. And if she went to HR, she would be putting her job in jeopardy. And the answer would probably be, look, that's the game here. You play it or leave.
And that's where, HR companies, many are often tilted towards the company.
Right, because, that's the problem that somebody said to me, which was fascinating. And that is, hey, you know what? HR companies on Wall Street are basically about, yes, we want to foster safe places and do all of this, but they're part of the organization. And I think that employees feel like if I go to HR, the HR person is not there to protect me. The HR person is there to protect the organization. That's who pays his or her salary. And I think that's a problem right there.
That's a problem. And of course, they don't want any attention drawn to the company if something gets out. And I will say not every HR company operates that way, but I think that is a sort of conflicted setup right there. And I think that there's one of the many, many things that this whole movement is teaching us is that has to change. If I were going to start a business, I would want to start a consulting company to come in and talk to HR departments about how to revamp their workplaces so that this doesn't happen.
In fact, we are doing a number of those initiatives to work with companies, not just in this area of gender relationships and gender norms, but especially focused on this younger generation just coming into the workforce. First of all, they've grown up with a completely different set of expectations. They're looking for experiences rather than experience. They're not looking at career. The average first job is 9 months versus 18 months a decade ago. Women are staying in the jobs longer. They're more likely to be the primary or equal wage earner in the home. They're more likely to be single later into their careers, and they're staying in the job. So I believe over the next 5 years, we're going to see a purging of HR groups that focus on past needs and realities instead of future ones. We're going to see a shift in men leaving their jobs for a variety of reasons, including being purged out because of sexual misbehavior. We're also going to see women taking those jobs and staying in their careers longer and being more likely to get promotions. The challenge that I look at is how do we look at young men who are just coming into the workforce and embrace them, support them, make sure that there's continue to be supporters of feminism, which many of them are, as opposed to turning against women and seeing themselves as being the mistreated gender.
Now, that's a fascinating thing because, the last thing that I think of when I'm going through the analysis of this issue is like, oh, how do I protect young men? Of course, the young men are the sort of the saviors because they are the ones that are shifting. Jack, you said in the book that the last generation of what you call traditional men is in their late 20s.
Yeah.
So describe what is that traditional man?
The traditional men are the ones who hold on to the tenets of the negative patriarchy, who believe that the man is the provider, believe that it's the man's role and job to be out of the home, in the workforce, providing for the family, that he has rights God-given because he's male to be more powerful financially, more powerful from a regulatory point of view, more powerful from a physical point of view. Young men don't hold those beliefs. The negative patriarchy has fundamentally been destroyed, but as we're seeing now in politics, it's in jeopardy of coming back in force as a backlash.
Leigh, I'm wondering, do you see that? I mean, in Silicon Valley, have you seen it, and what are these companies doing to address it?
Well, Silicon Valley, it's funny because I do agree with Jack. The younger generation has all kinds of different views on everything. I mean, look at how fast we've moved as a society on issues like diversity and gay marriage and everything. And so much of this is coming from the younger generation, a different value system. But you take some of these young men who are still being shaped and formed, and you put them in the petri dish of Silicon Valley, which has big problems, and that's their formative years, and that's how they're shaped, and that's not a good thing. That's just a small slice of society. But I do think those companies are very aware. Those companies are dealing with a lot right now between the harassment epidemic, which sort of started in Silicon Valley and then was quickly overshadowed by Hollywood and then the rest of culture. But it's very bad there. And then also the greater seismic issues around is tech a force for good or force for evil, with everything that Facebook and Google and all these companies are going through right now. So they're really dealing with a whole reckoning on a lot of things. When it comes to the workplace issues, I mean, I think they're just like the rest of companies trying to figure out, how can we do away with this? How can we fix this? And there are some tangible things that many of them are starting to talk about. It's not just about fixing the HR department. It's about installing proportional consequences so that there's no zero tolerance. So if you look at someone the wrong way, you're ousted. Establishing people throughout the organization to hear complaints who aren't in HR so that people can go to people they feel comfortable with. Having actual repercussions where people actually lose their jobs and don't just have to apologize and spend 2 weeks in rehab.
This is Better Off with Jill Schlesinger.
We'll get back to our interview with Leigh Gallagher and Jack Myers in just a second. You know, one place where you don't have to worry about equality? At our sponsor, Betterment. Everyone is treated equally. Betterment is the largest independent online financial advisor, and the company provides personalized advice for your financial planning needs. Woman, man, gender nonspecific, whatever you are, you can go straight to Betterment. They offer low, transparent advisory fees compared to traditional services. And one really cool feature of Betterment is that it is a way to look at all of your wealth. Betterment gives you a clear view of your net worth when you sync your outside accounts like bank accounts and other investments. And Betterment shows you how much your outside accounts are costing you in fees and uninvested cash. And as your personal investment manager, Betterment always has your back. They don't get commissions for recommending funds. They don't have funds of their own. That means they do what they believe is right for you. For more information, visit betterment.com/betteroff. And now back to our interview with Leigh Gallagher and Jack Myers.
It's interesting. When I started doing research for the future of men, and I started paying attention to my own interaction and my own behaviors, and I'd realized that when I was with a small group of men at a social event, 3 or 4 men, 5 men gathered together talking, I started timing how long it would take before the first inappropriate comment, misogynistic or objectifying comment were made, and it was about 2 minutes.
2 minutes, huh? That long?
Yeah, exactly. Some 30 seconds. Sometimes it was the opening comment to break the so-called ice. And I started saying, after a while of listening to this and realizing I can't be a part of this given the position I'm taking with the future of men, and as hopefully a leader in ending some of these attitudes and fostering new behaviors. And so I started calling them out when they'd say it.
And how would you do that? Let's go do an example.
I would say I can't be a part of this conversation. That's an inappropriate comment. Would you say that if your wife or girlfriend were here, or if it were mixed company?
No, that's why I'm saying it.
And exactly. And I started walking away, and about a third of the men would make fun of me or have some snide comment. Well, we're not going to talk to you anymore. About a third of the men would simply ignore it, and about a third of the men would come over to me afterwards and ask me why.
That's interesting.
And it was typically the younger guys who were falling into these patterns of behavior who wanted to understand, how can they not participate in this?
I will say many people in Silicon Valley are we're hearing anecdotes of that sentiment seeping in among men. Adopting, some people call it the Mike Pence rule, not wanting to go out to dinner. I mean, I've worked with men my entire career. Business journalism, I mean, it's actually pretty 50-50. And when you're talking about how someone said an inappropriate comment, Jack, I mean, I actually have never I've never had a problem. And I don't know why, but I mean, it's not been an issue in my particular workplace and industry.
Jack, in your book, The Future of Men, One of the things that you cite is a Stanford Graduate School of Business study that showed women who are able to develop the male qualities of assertiveness, confidence, and aggressive behavior, and who know when to use these behaviors, have more success in business. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the continuation of that paragraph talks about how men who can develop the more traditional feminine qualities of collaboration, multitasking, giving credit to others, can also do better. We're seeing a merging of the traditional gender qualities or characteristics in young people today, where to define a young person, a young woman today as having traditional male or female characteristics, most of them wouldn't know what you're talking about, because what we're seeing today in this lean-out generation of young women is a more focus on their careers, more focus on what they can contribute to society, how they can be more assertive, how they can ask to get paid what they have the right to be paid. And we're seeing in men more of a collaborative undertone to and the ability to multitask, because they've all grown up together on the internet. The concept of traditional characteristics, I think, is ending, and it's very important when we think of solutions and we look at HR groups and corporations and organizations that have women's groups. I think they need to start looking at how they can broaden out and also embrace young men. The last thing we want to do when young men come into an organization is turn them over to the old boys network. And that's all there is for them right now. We want to embrace them, and there's no organized structure to embrace young men, especially young white men, to help support, guide, and mentor them. And I think rather than trying to say, let's keep the young men and young women separate when they come into organizations, let's bring them all together and create a uniform mentoring and support group that cuts across all gender norms.
It's interesting because these employee network groups seem to me a place where there is a lot of that happening, that bringing them in rather than shutting them out is really the way to go, right?
Absolutely. I think absolutely. And, I joke a lot that one day, we have this Most Powerful Women Summit, and it was born out of the notion that women executives were few and far between. This was 20 years ago when we founded it. And I always joke that one day we're going to have the Most Powerful Man's Summit because they will be the minority.
God willing.
It's not a joke.
Right,
But
it'd be nice if it were the most powerful people's summit.
It would. And on the notion of, women needing to be aggressive to compete with men, I do think that was the case with the first generation of women in business, just like they had to dress like men and act like men. And that's when you got into the position where there could only be one woman in the room, and so the women were competing with each other. And that's really changed. And I actually think, and studies have shown this, that women and men do lead differently for the reasons you said, Jack. Women are better at consensus building, have more EQ, bring more humility to the table. Look at how Mary Barra, when she took over GM, the first thing she did, she was so contrite, she apologized, and she got to work and she made it better. These are not stereotypes. Men and women do lead differently. And the skills that women bring to the table are the very skills that a lot of the new, the jobs that are going to take us into the future demand. And so I think that the cards are increasingly in the future going to be stacked in women's favor in terms of career development and in terms of position in the workplace.
Well, I completely agree with that. I think there's a huge amount of statistical evidence to support that, Leigh. For example, among women under 30, childless and unmarried, they're out-earning young men under 30 by 8% nationally and 20% in major cities. In terms of men's groups, we're seeing more and more groups form to support men, and many of them are very positive, supportive, and reinforce all the positive issues we're talking about here. But then there are other men's groups that have formed and are forming that I call the angry men's groups.
Tell them to go get an education, and then they can stop being so angry.
Well, a number of them are very well educated. A number of them are very powerful, and they're coming together because they feel undermined. They feel like they're losing their place in society.
What are these white dudes with all the advantages in the world crying about? That they're losing some of those advantages?
Absolutely.
They're so awful. I want names, and then we can publicly humiliate them.
They're not, well, they're losing everything that they've grown up to believe in terms of who they are as a man, what a man stands for, what the definition of a man is. We have to recognize we're redefining men, and we see this in media too, and in advertising, where you look back over the last 30 to 40 years of men, and one of the few positive role models you can find is, of all people, Bill Cosby. And you look at the men who are buffoons in TV shows, where the wives or women always have to come to save them from their mistakes or their errors or their naivety. You look at men in beer commercials who are misogynist and sexist, where the woman is beautiful, scantily clad woman is moving them. A guy who can't even pick out his own analgesic or know how to take a paper towel to wipe up the counter. And when we do see positive male role models, which is very rare but more frequently, typically they're with their daughters and not with their sons.
Yeah, that's weird.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
You know, I wrote a piece about this, actually, not totally about that, but just the images in our culture. And by the way, Sheryl Sandberg, when she founded the Lean In movement, one of the first things she did was focus on getting more women in advertising images, which it didn't even really occur to me until that movement came out, and I thought, my God, of course, even a woman standing at the table giving the presentation instead of a man.
It goes on and on. We have this permeating society, permeating music, media, advertising.
We do.
And we need to take the lessons that have been learned by the women's movement facing down objectification in TV advertising and begin to bring those same kinds of issues to the forefront about how men are portrayed. And perceived because of media.
That's a great point.
I have marveled, being the old feminist that I am, that for a while there were a lot of younger women, much younger than I, who would be like, I'm not a feminist. And I'm like, shut up. Yeah, you are. Like, wake up. That, I think, that notion of like feminism is dead, it hath arisen and it has come back. And I'm wondering, Jack, now how you see in the near term what happens with that passion and that energy.
Yeah. The question I have about the current wave of outings among the rich, powerful, and wealthy is how does that filter down to the local Walmart, to the McDonald's, to the workplace that the average American is a part of, and where women are being subjected to harassment and objectification every single day. How does it filter down, and how are they empowered to respond?
I think that's a really great question. I mean, the New York Times did a great piece about
the GM.
The women in I think it was GM or Ford plant. Yeah, it was. And those are industries and workplace situations that aren't as quote unquote woke as some of us in media towers in Manhattan, right? And don't have the resources if they can't risk their jobs. I mean, it's really hard. I think there's more of an awareness. I mean, I love how this Time's Up movement in Hollywood, the purpose of these funds that they've raised is to go to women who can't mount defenses for themselves. And I think we need to see a lot more of that. And I think it's going to take a long time for this awareness to permeate, to make it comfortable in those kinds of workplaces for people to come forward. I think it's.
I think we're going to see more and more people using their mobile device and the recording ability and the ability
the
to
most
just
democratizing.
Yep.
Thank you, Steve Jobs. I mean, now we can record anything. It's brought to light so many things. But I also think that we are in the middle of a real transformative shift. I mean, it was only 20, 30 years ago that women started entering the workforce in mass, in significant numbers. And now we're at a point where it's we don't bat an eye at a woman CEO, but we're not there yet, And so 20 years from now, it's going to be more. And we're already seeing at our women's conference, we asked the audience who's the primary breadwinner and who has a stay-at-home spouse, and many people's hands went up. And so now you're going to have kids raised, boys raised by powerful women, and I think that's going to have a big, big shift. We're having, we will have a female president soon. We're crossing all these markers for the first time. We had a woman running the Fed. I mean, and I think it's only going to grow. It was only in 2001 there were only 3 women on the Fortune 500. Now they're 26, 27. That's not enough. That's crazy. That's 6% in some. But, it's moving fast, and I think that as it continues to move, we'll see more.
And as you mentioned, stay-at-home dads and how many women raise their hands, say their husband is stay-at-home dad. We need to start redefining the stay-at-home dad as opposed to being an out-of-work dad, which many people automatically assume. He's a dad who's making a choice for his family, for himself, and for his partner.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to honor, recognize, and reward those people who make those choices and not assume that they're somehow out of work or not making the choice to be at home with their families.
And that also assumes, by the way, that the family has the resources.
Yeah,
to
I was
have
just
only
going to say
one
that.
working parent.
Exactly.
I mean, this is the CEO group of CEO women. Of course, it's
Right. They've
possible.
got 3 nannies and one of the parents is at home. So that's good.
It's not possible
And we
for
also
everyone.
need to open up and create positive role models for men as nurses. There's a United Healthcare ad where there's a male nurse treating a young cancer patient, and it's a very positive role model of him being caring and open and vulnerable. And we need to empower men, just as we've empowered women to be in the STEM careers. We need to empower men to be in what I call the HEAL careers: health, education, administrative, and library sciences.
Did you make that up?
I don't think so, but
Okay,
I take
I'm going to
credit
give it
for
to you.
anyway.
I like that. Heal. All right. Very good. Okay, before we finish up, what gives you hope right now, Jack?
It gives me hope. This younger generation gives me a tremendous amount of hope. They're an open generation. They're a generation who cares about each other, who cares about society, who cares about improving the world. And they're a society they're a group that has grown up, a cohort that's grown up without looking at gender as being a defining characteristic. They look at gender as a spectrum as opposed to being a man or woman, male or female. You're on the gender spectrum somewhere. And I believe that they are going to be a very powerful force for transformation and change.
Leigh?
What gives me hope is just how this conversation has been blasted out into the open, and I think that's a wonderful thing. I think in many ways, it's up to the press that everyone's going to the press. That's the way these things are coming out. I mean, it's not like we have like a board, like the medical board. There's no kind of central organization to sort of vet everything, and maybe that's something that someday will emerge. But that gives me hope. And then just the incredible momentum that women in positions of power and leadership and that entire movement has. It's unstoppable.
Oh, I love that. Jack, we started the show. I asked you your best financial decision. You said it was buying Facebook at $18 a share. What is your worst financial decision?
My worst was leaving the corporate world many, many years ago and starting my own business. I'm sure I'd be making a lot more money today, but would not have had as much time with my family, not have had as much fun, and frankly, I'd probably right now be worrying about what I do next, and I'm not worried about that now.
Oh, fantastic. Leigh, what do you say?
My worst financial decision. I don't own any real estate.
Oh, Leigh Gallagher is on the
Yeah.
hunt. She needs an apartment. Will all the folks out in New York City get it going? I want to thank you both so much. Leigh Gallagher, she is the senior editor at large for Fortune. Her book is called The Airbnb Story, How 3 Ordinary Guys Disrupted an Industry, Made Billions, and Created Plenty of Controversy. It's out in paperback when?
February 13th.
Jack Myers, founder of Media Village, but author of the most prescient book I could imagine called The Future of Men. It was initially subtitled Masculinity in the 21st Century, but when the paperback comes out later this spring, it's going to be called Men on Trial. Is that right?
Men on trial, because all of us are. And we need to recognize every day in all of our actions that we're going to be judged by our behavior.
And not just by your maker, by society. Thank you both so much.
Thanks, Jill.
Well, thank you so much to Leigh Gallagher and Jack Myers for joining us today. Don't forget, we've got new episodes of this podcast, Better Off, on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Just go to wherever you download those podcasts and subscribe. Don't forget to leave us a comment. We haven't asked for that in a while, so please do that as well. If you have a question, email us, askjill@betteroffpodcast.com. That's askjill@betteroffpodcast.com. If you've missed any portion of any of our shows, you can go to JillOnMoney.com and check them out. Our music is composed by Joel Goodman. We're distributed by Cadence 13. Mark Talercio is the most excellent executive producer ever. And we are sponsored by Betterment, the largest independent online financial advisor. We'll see you next week.